Good morning again. Our first presenter will be Bridget Lynch, presenting on effective land management on grassland and sea fluxes.
Thank you, Joy. My name is Bridget Lynch. I'm a Senior Research Officer in the Environment, Soils and Land Use Department in Teagasc and Johnstown Castle. I'm presenting this paper on behalf of MacDara O'Neill, who was the Gaseous Emissions Research Officer working on the programme until recently. So in Ireland, agriculture is the largest contributor to total greenhouse gas emissions at 37.5%. We have a target to cut greenhouse gas emissions before 2030 by 25%. We have a marginal abatement cost curve analysis that sets out a suite of technologies and the cost of those technologies that are farm ready that can be stacked to mitigate against greenhouse gas emissions, and also we have an ammonia abatement cost curve analysis as well. A new MAC is due out this year, and we believe that carbon sequestration can offset our national emissions. So part of our suite of measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions includes improved cropland and grassland management on mineral soils. And this is part of our national roadmap towards carbon neutrality by 2050. So all European countries need to evaluate their nitrates regulations. In Ireland, we have a programme called the Agricultural Catchments Programme that evaluates our nitrates action programme, and that was established in 2008 and has been evaluating nitrogen and phosphorus nutrient transfer continuum over that period of time. So it looks at, I suppose, the source of those nutrients on farm level, the mobilisation of them, the transfer through the landscape, and the impact of those in our river network of choice and the freshwater ecology with regards to the impact of those. We have 6 small agricultural catchments that we've been studying since 2008 that vary in their agricultural land use and soil type as well. So in the most recent funding phase of the programme, it runs in 4-year funding cycles. In addition to the water monitoring infrastructure that we have in the agricultural catchments, and you can see the scale of that and the timing of it, can be monthly right up to measurement at the catchment outlet every 10 minutes of nitrogen and phosphorus, along with other parameters of water quality. In the most recent phase of the programme, we've decided to expand the biophysical data collection to include gaseous emissions. So nationally, I suppose we want to see the regulation that's in place with regards to trying to improve water quality. Has that a complementary impact on gaseous emissions, or is it antagonistic? And there is a 10-year review of the programme that was published in 2022 if you want to learn more about it. So in this paper, we're focusing on grassland sites. So the first one was an intensive dairy site used for grazing and for silage production. So the Eddick Variance Tower was situated in the milking platform. This site was one of our freely draining catchments, stocked at 2.9 livestock units per hectare, so a high stocking density. And the sward was made up of perennial ryegrass and white clover. The second grassland site was a zero grazing / silage, so a cutting site. Again, a freely draining site, and again, it was made up of perennial ryegrass and white clover sward. And the final site was an extensive grazing site, so it was grazed continuously throughout the year by co-grazing sheep and beef animals. This site is a karstified limestone site. The stocking intensity was 1.3 livestock units per hectare, and this was permanent pasture compared to the previous 2 sites, which are improved pasture. For the Edicovariance tower site selection, there's quite a lot of work goes into selecting where they're going to be positioned in the landscape. There's a decision support tree that the researchers work through to decide where to position the tower. We need a flat terrain, a southwest fetch. We need the management information in order to do a full carbon budget. And most importantly, we need farmer engagement. So all of these towers are out on commercially privately owned farmland. These towers are part of a much wider network, they're part of the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory, which is a network of 30 flux towers that are being deployed across Ireland to monitor carbon dioxide fluxes in a range of soil types and agricultural land use. So they are positioned on cropland and grassland, and the aim is to investigate agricultural land use and the management impacts to provide estimates, annual estimates, and the drivers of carbon gain and loss. So they're being deployed at the minute. The ones that I'm presenting are some of the first ones that were deployed, and we've 5 more to be installed by the end of this month. So the Edicovariance tower infrastructure, if you're not familiar with it, so it's what we call a micrometeorological method. So in addition to the carbon dioxide and water vapor analyzer that's pointed out by number 1 there in the graphic, we have a number of climatic infrastructure and equipment that's included in it as well. So it's important to know, I suppose, what are the climatic conditions in the fetch that the Edicovariance tower is measuring the carbon dioxide in, because they're huge drivers, obviously, of the carbon dioxide fluxes. You can also have a methane or nitrous oxide analyzer attached to the tower as well. These ones I'm going to talk about today just have the carbon dioxide and water vapor analyzer. They take 10 measurements per second, 365 days a year, so they're highly automated. They measure carbon dioxide that is sequestered through photosynthesis, and also carbon dioxide that is respired from the ecosystem, and that's from the full ecosystem, so the plants that are growing, and also from the animals that are grazing in some cases, or from the harvest through machinery. The difference between carbon dioxide that is sequestered through photosynthesis and that is respired is net ecosystem carbon dioxide exchange. And as I said previously, the biomet sensors help us identify what the drivers of the net ecosystem exchange is. So before I go on to go through the results slides, just to explain some of the terminology if you're not familiar with it. So the unit of measure on the y-axis is fluxes of carbon dioxide per metre squared per second. On the y-axis you'll see the days of the year. The blue line shows the ecosystem respiration. The red line shows gross primary productivity or photosynthesis, and the difference between these two is then our net ecosystem exchange, which is represented by the green line. So where you see the net ecosystem exchange, the green line below 0, and 0 is represented by a vertical black line, that shows that we're seeing a sink of carbon dioxide represented by a negative value. If it's a positive value, that means that's a source of carbon dioxide. Okay, so this shows our intensive dairy grazing site. So the data that we have here runs from the 28th of January to the 5th of September 2022. At the top of the slide, you can see the contour map showing the flux footprint. Maybe a bit small for you to be able to see, but the contour lines represent different percentages. So the outside line that you can see there says 80%. So 80% of the fluxes that we're recording can be explained by what's happening in that contour line. Also, we've got the windrows map there for your information. So overall, I suppose the net ecosystem exchange fluxes at this site were typical of what we would expect of a rotational grazing system. Carbon uptake progressively increased to a maximum onto a series of cuts, and we saw that the max uptake was recorded just before the first harvest, and then after harvest we see that the net ecosystem exchange becomes a source of carbon dioxide, and then once the grass recovers, it returns to becoming a sink of carbon dioxide. But this, I suppose, more carbon dioxide is being sequestered earlier in the year, in the earlier cuts, and that starts to decrease as we progress throughout the grazing season. Between harvest 4 and harvest 5, you can see that the net ecosystem exchange starts to become a negative value at some time points, and that's linked to a drought period that we had in July, August, September in Ireland in 2022. This slide shows a zero grazing site. So this data goes from the 28th of April until 31st of October 2022. Again, you can see the contour map showing the flux footprint. In this site, we found that the flux magnitude coincides with cutting period. The rate of carbon uptake was lower after defoliation. We again saw that the peak carbon uptake was earlier in the year, and as the year progresses, and again probably confounded with weather conditions in 2022, we found as the year progressed, as you move to harvest 4 and harvest 5, where we had drought conditions, that the carbon dioxide became a source rather than a sink in periods of time. Finally, our extensive grazing site. So this data runs from the 16th of June until the 31st of November. Remembering that the animals were continuously grazing this grassland, and so we don't have specific harvest represented by the vertical lines in this graph. At this side, we found that the max daily GPP, or your photosynthesis, was higher compared to the dairy grazing sites, but the respiration, the ecosystem respiration, was also higher compared to the dairy grazing sites. So as a result, the net ecosystem exchange was about half that compared to what we recorded in the dairy grazing and the zero grazing sites. The trends, what you notice mostly, the trends of net ecosystem exchange don't have large peaks and troughs as they did where we're harvesting biomass on a rotational grazing basis. And we found that of 59% of the days recorded that we had net carbon uptake. Similar to the previous sites, once you hit about day 300, carbon uptake slows down. Again, showing a seasonal influence. This graph shows the meteorological effects from the biomet sensors. So we found that albedo, incoming shortwave radiation, and soil temperature were temporally similar across the sites. But we found that volumetric soil water content in the dry stock extensively grazed site was greater, and it was almost double the value compared to the dairy grazing and the zero grazing sites. So showing that higher respiration rate that we're recording for the extensive site may be down to that higher volumetric water content in the soil, in addition to maybe more respiration and activity from below ground activity and root networks in an older grassland compared to the newer grassland that we had at the dairy grazing and zero grazing site. So in summary, cutting and grazing frequency observed to influence net ecosystem exchange, and the rate of carbon uptake peaked just before defoliation and was lower after defoliation, so peaks and troughs. Recovery period seems to take longer as the season progresses, or where weather limits growth, which was in the case with a drought that we experienced in 2022. The extensive grazing dry stock site, the trends of net ecosystem exchange fluctuate widely, and that may be down to the weather conditions, the management, the underlying soil processes, and respiration. So I suppose these are initial observations. These edicovariance towers are in those sites for the long term, and I suppose long-term data sets and greater continuity of the data will help us to identify management and weather effects on net ecosystem exchange and also on the carbon balance. So the continuing work, I suppose, is to get the full management data from the farmers, and to do a full carbon balance so that we can report tons of carbon that are sequestered on a per hectare basis. There's ongoing work looking at the soil organic carbon stock at the sites, looking at soil organic carbon sampling and doing shallow and deeper pits. And this is, I suppose, all part of our national roadmap and the Teagasc strategy, that by Q1 of 2027, that we will have specific soil carbon sequestration emission factors to feed into our national inventories. And with that, I'll finish up. For anyone that's interested, we're hosting a Catchment Science Conference in Wexford in Ireland between the 7th and 9th of November. If it's of interest and you think you have material to submit, there is a website live. And you can get more outputs from the programme through social media or our website. So Joy, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. And we may have some time for questions. I just want to make sure that our 10:30 presenter isn't here. Okay. If not, then please feel free to ask Bridget some questions, and we will reconvene at 10:45. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, so the question was, will we be including nitrous oxide in some of the sites in the future? In the sites that I showed today, we won't be including nitrous oxide analyzers at those sites. The additional analyzers are quite expensive, so the network that we have in place has used up the full of the funding that was received from the Department of Agriculture. But there are some sites in the network of 30 that have nitrous oxide analyzers. So at the Johnstown Castle site, we have a nitrous oxide analyzer there, and some will have methane analyzers as well, but it's largely focused on carbon dioxide. Yeah.
It's more of like a pragmatic question, but so this is a grazing setting. You had these towers set up in your grazing. How do you keep the animals from affecting it or bumping into it or messing up any of the readings?
Yeah, so look, when you ask commercial farmers to install these on their farms, you don't want the animals in around them. They're expensive pieces of equipment, so we fenced them off. So they're fenced as close around the gear that the animals can't reach into them. But it's important that we get the full fluxes from the full ecosystem, so we want to be able to record the animals as they pass through. So that is important, but we just fence around it.
Okay. So what's the radius of it?
So they take in about 150 meters from the tower point.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's the general thought on the amount that nitrous oxide percentage-wise factors into this, even if it can't be measured with this current equipment? How big is the nitrous oxide in the...
Yeah, so nitrous oxide is a major contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, it's largely coming from fertilizer, chemical fertilizer. So we do have strategies to try and reduce that. So we're using protected urea in our grasslands. It isn't compulsory. It's advised to try and use protected urea. So we do have strategies to try and reduce nitrous oxide, and those farmers that are using these towers will be implementing those strategies. So hopefully we'll catch up on those nitrous oxide mitigation strategies in the sites that do have the nitrous oxide analyzer.
Any more questions? Okay, I think we're ready to proceed to our next presentation. Up next is Applying the Concepts of Animal Husbandry to Human Health by John Madden.
Good morning. It's a privilege to be here, and I just wanted to give a little talk here today that comes a lot from my own experience, because I think about what's going on at this meeting every minute, because I happen to practice in Dillon, Montana. When I look out my office window, I see cattle on rangeland, and so it's an incredible deal to be able to live in a where I don't see any buildings out my window. I see the range. So the title of my talk: Applying the Concepts of Animal Husbandry to Human Health. If civilizations were born in our grazing lands, perhaps it is our grazing lands that will ultimately provide the pathway to a survivable future for humankind. And that comes from the preface from the history of the International Grasslands Congress, 1927 to 2020. So I was given the lead-in right from the Congress. Is it time for a paradigm shift when it comes to our thinking about progress in human and environmental health? I propose that the answer is yes. It is my belief that the pastoralists can give us a model for regeneration of environmental and human health. Technology has been used to dominate nature. The result is a dramatic increase in the number of resources required to maintain human health. Saying that we are even maintaining human health may be wrong, as added years may be added years of disability rather than functionality. Life expectancy in the United States has declined 2 years in a row, and this cannot be attributed to COVID-19. In parallel, there has been a decline in soil health, as is measured by inputs required to maintain productivity. There is still a significant amount of soil mining with extractive cropping practices going on. In the very near future, production may be declining due to laws limiting chemical inputs coupled with rapidly rising fertilizer prices. In order to give some context to my talk, my personal story is relevant. I spent much of my early adult life working with scientists at Utah State University in the College of Natural Resources. As a young man with a lot of energy, it was very invigorating time where I could work doing the hard manual labor of ranch work as part of research projects. It was intellectually stimulating environment to work with individuals working on research studies for their PhDs and master's degrees. I really enjoyed working with academics, but I could not see myself going on in academia. I jumped the fence, so to speak, and got a job cowboying on a large cattle ranch in the West Desert region of Utah. The ranch work gave me a bit of taste for the pastoralist life. Grazing animals in a natural environment, the cattle were suited to their environment through natural selection. The ranch where I worked had a 100-year-old herd that had basically grown up in that environment. They spent the vast majority of their time grazing with some supplemental feed in the winter. The cattle were highly adapted at the least, and they were extremely healthy. We did do some doctoring of the cattle on occasion, and that generated my interest in medicine. But for the most part, it seems as though as long as we made sure the mother cows had adequate access to forage, they were amazingly healthy and lived long, productive lives. One thing led to another, and I ended up in medical school and finally completing my education as a family practice physician. I practice in a rural setting where a large proportion of the economy is based on livestock and native rangeland. The livestock are healthy, but the animal husbandrymen are not. They are overweight and have most of the manifestations of metabolic syndrome. In my 30 years of medical practice, the metabolic condition of the world has declined rapidly. Until 10 years ago, the same was true for most of my patients with observable declines in their metabolic health. Essentially, many of my patients were foundered. Founder being equine metabolic syndrome, the humans have human metabolic syndrome, just called metabolic syndrome, which is a manifestation of hyperinsulinemia. The definition of human metabolic syndrome is 3 of the following things: increased abdominal obesity, elevated blood pressure, abnormal glucose levels, high triglycerides, and a low HDL cholesterol. The current medical paradigm is to treat these with medications and to treat each of them as separate problems, not acknowledging the root cause. Rarely, if ever, is the question asked or answered, why does the patient have this condition? Unfortunately, it is not in the financial interest of anyone in the medical profession to answer these questions. The medications continue to be more expensive, leading to greater profits and everyone involved in providing the care. This is true at least in the United States. Medications for blood pressure, blood sugar control, cholesterol may prolong life, but they do not significantly improve one's sense of well-being. I started to tell my patients that they needed to treat themselves as well as they treated their livestock. I asked them how they would treat a foundered horse to restore health. It is interesting that in veterinary medicine, metabolic syndrome is defined by measuring insulin levels if you don't just go by observation. Whereas in the medical field, you can't even measure an insulin level as part of the regular medical care. It's not a covered test. When clinical signs are evident, it leads to the measurement of insulin levels and insulin sensitivity. It is recognized that treating equine metabolic syndrome is primarily a nutritional thing, and believe me, they've tried a few human medications on the horses, but it didn't provide the benefit. The treatment is always dietary modification. In humans, the many manifestations of metabolic syndrome are treated as though they are separate diseases. The underlying cause is not really addressed. If you know an insulin level is high, the solution would be straightforward. Eliminate sugar and starch from the diet and don't eat as often. That is all you need to know. But we make it complicated. With this technically simple dietary intervention, metabolic syndrome can be reversed. The treatment for metabolic syndrome can be obtained from food production on grasslands. Animal-sourced protein and the use of fat for fuel will reverse metabolic syndrome. I explain to my patients that once metabolic syndrome has developed, they have to change their diet just the way one would change the diet for a horse with a similar condition. There's really not much going back. Almost all of acute and chronic medical conditions are worsened by hyperinsulinemia. There's a book written, Why We Get Sick, and that was the book was just a litany of examples of how insulin is part of chronic disease. Then came COVID-19, which this is the first time I'll say it in public. COVID-19 was basically a disease of hyperinsulinemia or age. I hope that I'm not in trouble now. Back to the pastoralists. Still living according to their traditional cultures, pastoralists are able to produce food and other animal products with minimal, if any, fossil fuel inputs. Indigenous people rarely suffer from chronic disease. The acute and chronic effects of trauma are significant, so I'm sure that if you go to an area where people don't have access to good orthopedic care, you will see crooked limbs and people limping along, but you won't see folks that are foundered. Infectious diseases are also problems, but inevitably the pastoralists will integrate into the global economy. We heard about that in one of the sessions earlier. People are moving to the cities. So as they integrate, they are at much greater risk of developing metabolic syndrome because they haven't been exposed to industrial processed foods any time in their history. Hopefully we can learn the lessons of history and not destroy their culture, especially where it was in sync with the laws of nature. This is especially true when it comes to processed foods entering into a society. When processed foods become available, chronic disease follows. Now in the more technologically advanced areas, there is malnourishment because of overconsumption of refined foods. Pastoralists are able to produce food without any fossil fuel input. Returning more land to pasture has great potential. Technology can help with land management by controlling livestock movement. If technology means adding chemicals to the land, it is likely to disturb the balance that is needed for downgrade the land rather than improve it. The pastoralist and the urban dweller are both in need of a new conception of health security. And so that's just my finding that I relate human health, and I say the reason why we're not all dead if we're over 40 is because of all the meds, but we only needed the meds because we've been misguided on what's healthy eating and living. And this is a question I want to just throw out there, is that I haven't yet heard how much food energy is lost because animal fat is thrown away routinely all the time. In every restaurant and in every home, people are still cutting off the fat, and that's where it's at. Any questions?
Thank you, John.
Where do you see life expectancy as a human population in 10 years?
Can you repeat the question?
Life expectancy in the next 10 years? It's
Decline?
definitely, because something else that happened during COVID was there was a dramatic worsening of metabolic syndrome. I mean, just like a hockey stick worsening and affecting the young, like in the pediatric population, and that'll make me cry. I mean, it's terrible. And older folks can't, if you don't get metabolic syndrome until you're 50 or 60, you're not going down with metabolic syndrome near like teenagers. It's just awesomely terrible in kids. And in pregnant women, the gestational diabetes is like, it's crazy bad. But it's kind of reversible if we can get this idea that you got to get rid of processed foods. Just blanket. But try and find something that isn't processed within a mile of here. I'd made the survey this morning. It's not there.
Well, how much of it is dependent upon us thinking a pill will solve all our issues?
Well, I used to have the paradigm of search insulin and then find a chronic problem and see a mechanistic relationship and prescribe an insulin-lowering diet and see something good happen. But then the last time, a couple weeks ago, I put in insulin and then I came up with a pill. There's a pill that's an insulin blocker, makes you pee sugar, not a good thing. And now so the big pharma has figured out what I've been doing, and a bunch of other doctors. But we're all off the beaten path. We could easily get complained to by the medical board. Fortunately, I'm not the first one. Yes.
Time for another?
Yeah.
So when you're treating patients, you have somebody who comes in with years of type 2 diabetes, and they comply with your suggestion of a dietary change. How immediate do you see effects in terms of reduced medication, improved metabolic health? Are we talking years or months or?
Days. They have to, this is so powerful that you have to say most people are on blood pressure medication. You have to be checking your blood pressure and be prepared to cut back. If you're checking your blood sugar, you have to be prepared to cut your insulin dose back. And that is the challenge, is that if you prescribe something that's prescription strength, people become dependent on the diet, and that if you go off the diet, you get sick. And you have to be, deprescribing is a big deal, and it's huge savings. So I mean, there's still so many missing parts in this, how good things can be. So, yes.
With your thoughts and your experience, a lot of us here are livestock producers. So how do we fit in with a more healthy society? Can we?
Sure. The thing that, just eat what you produce. And the sooner you learn about these concepts, the more flexible you are, because the ideal would be to be metabolically flexible, where you could eat a potato or you could eat a slice of bread and not actually have your blood sugar go over 200 and then crash. But you'd be amazed. You wear a continuous glucose monitor, you'd find out that what's recommended by the medical profession, having, it's actually in the diabetes prevention program to have skim milk on cornflakes. Well, that'll get your blood sugar over 200, and it'll get it down to 70 2 hours later, and you average it out, and your hemoglobin A1C looks okay. But you've been whipsawed all over the place. So that's my hope, is that continuous glucose monitors will expose terrible advice.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, our next presentation is Ruminant Agriculture, a tool for climate change mitigation by Breck Peterson Monks.
You want me to move it or?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. I'm Breck Peterson Monks from Agaro Carbon Alliance. Today I'll be presenting the concepts that we offer through Agaro Carbon Alliance, but it is very much livestock based for carbon storage. So Agaro Carbon Alliance launched in June 2021. We are a carbon crediting firm for crop and livestock producers here in the United States. It is a voluntary market. We are backed by Yara, a global leader in fertilizer out of Norway. And our venture came from Yara's announcement of green ammonia initiative, as well as wanting to look at their carbon footprint overall. So within the carbon markets around the world, we either have removal markets or we have avoidance markets. And these are very, very important to understand. Removal offset credits are essentially generated from activities that pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And then we have avoidance markets. And these activities actually reduce the emissions by preventing their release into the atmosphere. Agaro Carbon Alliance is part of the avoidance offset market. And we are trying to mitigate the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere via farming and ranching practices. Essentially, on the market today, individuals that are paying for carbon credits pay a premium for avoidance credits opposed to reduction or removal credits. So there's a huge demand. We hear about it often in the nightly news about climate change, carbon credits. Most large box companies, large industry are looking to offset their carbon footprint. Just Siemens, Walmart, Nike, 3M, and Google, they could take up 25% of the global supply right now of carbon credits that are available. And other Fortune 500 companies will essentially take up the rest of that global supply. And as we move toward carbon neutral as a planet, we will need more carbon credits generated. So at Agaro, we have projects registered with Verra, which is a carbon credit registry firm. And we have a croplands program as well as a pasture land program. And I will be talking about the pasture land program primarily today. Within the pasture land program that we have registered with Verra today, we offer 3 programs for ranchers to put into effect in their grazing systems. We have grazing improvement, often utilization of rotational grazing and tweaking their current practices, minimal nitrogen use on pasture lands or grasslands, provided we have mitigated our annual weed issues. We also have increased biodiversity, so increasing their forage base essentially. To date, Agaro Carbon Alliance has paid out $12 million in incentives to producers, and that's primarily in grassland acres in the United States. So the big thing is in order to do carbon storage in ranches, we need to have ruminants on the ground. And it is vital because they promote weed suppression through grazing. They defecate, obviously, adding organic matter back to the soil and increasing the soil microbiology population. And we also require their hoof action because this aerates the soil and also reduces particle size of residue to help incorporate that back into the system as organic matter. So with rotational grazing, like I previously said, this is essentially an altering of the stocking rate, changing the pasture size in which animals are grazing upon, altering the amount of grazing days in which those animals typically are grazing. This essentially will, over time, not immediately, improve the yield and forage intake, as well as improve the soil carbon in those acres. This is really important because obviously Agaro Carbon pays producers for the carbon they store. So we are trying to implement practices. Essentially, if individuals tweaked their rotational grazing practices, there could be the potential of storing or mitigating 148 to 700 megatons per year of CO2 equivalents. With biodiversity, this is essentially interseeding other forages. It could be another cereal or it could be another dicot, essentially, depending on what the forage system needs or the livestock needs in their systems. We do tailor situations to pastures that you put for weaning or pastures that you're calving in so that we are metabolically correct for our livestock. Essentially, by doing this, anytime you take a monoculture and make it a polyculture, you've increased that biodiversity, but the system is a lot better working overall, and so we're capable of storing more carbon. In this particular instance, if we can introduce a legume, obviously we've got nitrogen fixation at that juncture, which is really beneficial to the system, but a cereal plus a legume often is a lot more beneficial for carbon storage overall. We also have nitrogen fertilizer use. So, like I said, we need to make sure that we've taken care of our annual weed issues. Often these soils are low in N to begin with because ranchers often don't apply N to grasslands or pastures simply because it can be expensive. But essentially minimal N use primes the system, gets those microbes excited, and we can go ahead and start the carbon process, storage process, provided that there is adequate water. That nitrogen also can increase your forage base and increase your yield over time. But we have big questions, obviously, that we need to answer when we start doing this. With our verification firm, Vera, these 3 practices have been accepted, but we also do a lot of soil sampling in order to prove, in fact, what we're doing, as well as utilizing data set to model these potential practices over time. But the situation is that what Vera is putting forward as their methodology is based in the science that we do on a daily basis, but they also require that all soil samples are done over time, a time series, but go down to 30 centimeters. Often, because of cost, scientists in research settings don't go down to that 30 centimeters on a regular basis. And that's something as a scientific community that maybe we should think about doing moving forward in our research, simply to make sure that our climate models are functional, particularly for these carbon credit markets moving forward. Through carbon modeling, we take quite a bit of historical data from each producer. Obviously, we baseline the soil samples, model the baseline, and we also then go ahead and run a model associated with the practices that they plan on implementing for carbon storage to see what the potential is within their regions. So, as we all know, within the modeling, carbon is the glue that holds soil aggregates together and improves aggregate stability. We are essentially accruing a nationwide data set over time. Our contracts are 10 years long. We sample multiple times throughout that 10-year contract period. And so we are accruing a soil organic carbon data set that spans the whole entire United States, as well as internationally, because we do have a program in Brazil as well. But to move forward productively in the carbon market, we need to make sure that we have a methodology that is universal. This is a voluntary market, and provided that companies like Agaro Carbon Alliance set up their programs correctly, if it ever does become regulated, hopefully those who regulate the carbon market will look at us because we have set up a good framework to do so. But overall, essentially through utilizing grazing animals on pasture lands for carbon credit programs, we can store essentially what would be the equivalent of 432 million passenger, the emissions that come off of 432 million passenger vehicles could be stored a year, which is pretty phenomenal if we alter our grazing systems appropriately, because the semi-arid and arid grassland soils have the ability to store quite a bit of carbon over time. Thank you, guys.
Any questions?
In the UK, we're actually carbon sensitive to 97.
Yes.
So, we should be certain that it's got better as the others do. But if you're not getting comparable carbon results, obviously you're selling on that local market, whatever, is that a potential future?
I think it could be a potential future problem, particularly for the carbon credit market and for verification. Because this carbon credit concept was popular 20 years ago here in the United States and then crashed, and now it's a hot ticket item again right now all over, we need to universally be on the same page no matter what. And as a group of scientists, I previously was a federal soil scientist, we all need to get on the same page. We utilize ASTM methods for analysis, which is great. But our sampling needs to be universal. Yeah. Exactly. And it has to be time series in order for these models to function properly.
How long is the contract period?
So our contract period at Agaro is 10 years. You sign up to implement those practices for 10 years. We baseline soil sample at essentially time 0, time 5, and time 10 at the end of the 10-year cycle. So it's actually early 11. Yeah.
This is something I'm not have no previous knowledge on, but say if a farmer was to sell his carbon credits to another industry company, would that negatively affect the carbon footprint of the agriculture industry because credits from elsewhere from another industry?
So essentially, we're a carbon credit aggregator, and so we go pay the producer for the carbon credits in their land, right? And then we sell them to another group. The situation with going through a company like Vera, the registry firm, those carbon credits are GPSed, so they can only be sold once, and it doesn't necessarily affect the carbon footprint of ranching, but it affects the carbon footprint of large industry who are the major emitters. Does that make sense?
Yes, it doesn't negatively impact the ag industry emissions.
Right, and eventually as this market continues to progress, at some juncture, the producers are going to want to reduce their carbon footprint, so they're not going to sell their own carbon credits because that will then impact their footprint. But right now, agriculture in the US anyways is not looking at that. Betsy.
Does the carbon payment offset the cost of the practices?
It helps. It doesn't offset 100%. It essentially covers about 75% of it.
So is the payment based on initial conditions? If somebody's already in good shape, can they accumulate the same thing as somebody who's in poor shape?
So ideally, you would want poor land because you could get a bigger change, right? But the problem is that producers who have poor land, unless they bought it cheap and actually want to see the vision, often they're poor producers, and that's the reason that they're not producing grass and whatnot, and they're not storing carbon. So we're very particular on our producers that we sign up. But essentially, one of the big issues with the carbon credit market right now, if you're like a long-term no-tiller or a long-term cover cropper, you can't get into the program because you've been doing these practices for 20 years and you have great soil, but there's still the ability to accumulate carbon. You just won't make as much because you're already, the storage volume is less in good soil than it is in bad soil.
How long are your contracts with producers for the carbon payments?
So it's 10 years, then they can roll back over in 10 years?
Is there a database estimating the maximum carbon that can be stored where you say once you get to this organic matter level or carbon level in a certain area, you say you're probably not going to do any better?
Yeah, there's equations out there for that, absolutely.
So if I sign up today, do I get paid over a 10-year period? Yes. Or do I get paid today?
You can get paid in two different ways. You can pay for performance, and so you get paid at year 5 and year 10 after we do those soil samples, or you can have upfront payments, which is what Betsy was talking about, to help cover the cost of seed or nitrogen or putting in hard-lined fence, that type of stuff. And those payments go year 1 through 5, and then another one at the end of year 10.
So are you directly involved in helping the farmer, telling the farmer what to do?
So my official title is carbon science agronomist. I was on the sales team where I was constantly traveling, but I got moved to the science team. I do spend a lot of time with producers going through all of their acres and building management plans specifically for each individual rancher. Because if you sign up acres in Maine, they're different than acres in Florida, which are different than West Texas, and it's not one size fits all. Yes, sir.
So can I come back to the contract again? So if you lock in, are you locking in a price for 10 years?
Yes.
So why would I do that if I think my carbon price might be higher in 5 years?
So that's a possibility. And one of the things is with Agaro, we have a floor price. Our floor price is $16.50 a ton of carbon, and you can continue, you as the producer reap the benefit if the carbon market goes up. We pay that to you. One of the big deals.
So it's not a fixed price?
It's not a fixed price. It's a fixed floor price.
Well,
the ceiling is, we don't know where the ceiling is going to go. And one of the big deals is when Agaro started, or when Yara started this, and we started this project, we went to the idea that we asked the individuals who wanted the credits if we could produce credits in agricultural soils, what would you want them to look like? And right now there are agroforestry credits out there, but they're different than agricultural ranch credits or agricultural crop credits. And the situation with that is they gave us a very specific list. We want them to be verified. We want there to be science behind it, da-da-da-da-da. And when that happened, one of the big things was a lot of these individuals looking to offset their carbon footprint wanted a large chunk of money to go back to the producers. And so we are mediated by that.
We'll probably have time for more questions. I just want to make sure our 11:15 presenter is in the room. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
All right, our next presentation will be at 11:30.
Generally, people are saying it's about 5 or but there's a community of type 1 diabetics, so but they're achieving A1Cs below 5. Well, no, the standard here says we'll manage to see but we know that managing small vessel damage is occurring anywhere from 6 on up. And there are people, as I say, who say you need to be below 5.5. So there's this difference between what we know and what the regulators like. But yeah, so for some people, they need to reduce below 20 grams of carbohydrate. For other people, maybe below 50. It all depends on the background and where we're starting. I have to be pretty strict with no. I'm not that kind of guy. But metformin is one that I see a lot of use even from nutritional. But basically, if we can stop using medications at some point, that's but
Okay, and our final presentation this morning will be opportunities and challenges in augmenting honeybee forage sources with pasture legumes in southern Australia by Lachlan Ingram.
Good morning all. Thank you very much for attending. So my name's Lachlan Ingram. I'm going to be presenting this presentation today for Richard Hayes, who's one of my colleagues. And unfortunately, just Richard, for a variety of reasons, couldn't make the other conference. So I will do my best to answer any questions, but I make no promises. This presentation is really going to be about some work that Richard and his crew have recently started, giving a sort of a bit of a summary of basically trying to get a better understanding of what are the potential uses of a range of legumes in Australia for honeybee forage resources. So in Australia, honey production has always been traditionally done by standard apiarists, but it's essentially relied, very unusually for Australia, in basically our native systems. So our large range of eucalypt species, native trees and native shrub systems essentially. And so most of these are found on public lands, our state forests, etc. And it's a very dynamic system. You are essentially following, and that will obviously depend on the weather, the climate, where you are in the Australian continent, following the flowering patterns of those native trees and shrubs around the system. And as a result, because it's just relying on a native system, pollination was really not a requirement. We're not using bees to pollinate these things. We're really just using the nectar gathering process in order to produce honey. So pollination was definitely not sort of really up there at all. However, there's been, for a whole range of reasons, there's been increasing interest in the last couple of years to try and use a wide range of, well, I'll come back. We've had reduced access to public lands. This has been a whole range of reasons. Also, Australia, as they say, is the land of drought, floods and fires. We did have a fairly large fire a couple of years ago, which took out an enormous part of Australia. So we've lost we're increasingly losing a lot of our native trees and shrubs as resources for honeybees. And there's also been increasing focus for actually using honeybees for actually a pollination process rather than just producing honey per se. So we have a large opportunity. We have extensive areas of Australia which are put over to grazing system agriculture, so grassland production. Australia has had a long and proud history of introducing a range of introduced pasture species into the Australian grazing system, to our agriculture. And so we have probably in excess of over 30 pasture legumes that are used at some level across Australia. And so obviously this thing gives us rise to the ability to use these for honeybee foraging. We do have a great opportunity there. And again, because it gives us some good opportunities, some good synergistic benefits, basically, to try and not only improve honey production, but also try to improve more generically our grazing production. So increasing our output per unit of land. So again, potentially another source of income, both for honey producers as well as farmers, and also increasing pollination across our pasture systems. So many of our floral attributes of some of our species are relatively well understood. So these are our perennial legumes that are most commonly used in Australia. So our white clover, our red clover and our lucerne or alfalfa, depending on the continent you come from. However, so these are mainly perennial. However, a lot of our pasture legumes that we do use in Australia are our annual species. So things like a range of subclover is our most commonly used, some of our medics, etc. So we know little about those and what role they might play in terms of being a potentially useful source providing nectar for bees. So, however, there are challenges. Obviously, when you're trying to do this, ultimately, the ultimate end goal is, does a bee actually want to, go and visit a flower for a particular legume, which is obviously quite hard to do, particularly when you're doing relatively small plot trials. You've only got a small area. You've got very diverse flower morphologies across these different pasture legumes, differences in maturity, and that will obviously then depend also on time of year, climate, location, etc. The age of the inflorescence, so the effect of the climate, soil climate has strong impacts on nectar secretion, and just the very low nectar volumes that a lot of these flowers, which can be quite small in many cases, are actually going to be producing. So just trying to get a handle on all of those obviously makes it a fairly challenging project to try and do. So this project was funded by AgriFutures, which is basically the honeybee producers organisation. And so they funded a study, a 2-year study. It's called Clover for Bees. It was a pilot study. And again, it was funded by AgriFutures and the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. So their aim ultimately is to screen 20, actually it might have been 20 annual species, as to do some screening as to give an indication as to what are the best possible options that might likely, we can then take those screening trials into a larger scale field trial. So that was one of the objectives. The second objective was just try and develop some methodologies which could be used for ongoing and future studies. So this was, in fact, there was about 22, 23 different species which were actually used. You may not be able to see all of them, I do apologise for that. But these are probably the most commonly used annual legumes, generally speaking, that are used in Australian agriculture. There were some species that were not clovers, so we've got sandpoint, sulla, and we're also interested, but also again because these are commonly used pasture species, but they do produce quite a good flower. So it gives us some, a range of options, and again, these are generally very commonly used across Australia. So there were 4 field sites used, so again to try and get a good spread of climate and temperature across New South Wales. So Glen Innes is up in the northeastern area with relatively high rainfall of about annual average rainfall of about 840 mil. Then we come south down to Tokau, which is on the coast, so a little bit higher rainfall. Cowra is sort of the central west of the state with a little lower rainfall of about 620 mil, and then Wagga Wagga is on the southern end of New South Wales and a lot drier, so around about a 550 millimetre rainfall zone. So these small scale plots were sown in autumn 2022, so about a year old. So the approach at each of those sites consisted of really 4 different areas. One was just to compare the flowering window, i.e. when did they start flowering, when did they finish flowering, and try and get some estimate of the number of flowers in each of those, for each of those species. There was also estimates of the flower morphology that was undertaken at the Tokau site. So that's looking at things like inflorescence, sepal numbers, petals, keels, banner and wing dimensions, so much more detailed of the particular morphology of those particular flowers. Assessing apparent bee preference. Obviously there's a lot of things why a bee might be in a given location at any given point. It's obviously going to depend on what other species are present, whether they're flowering or not. But this is a fairly simple trial in that they will just be simply, are we actually seeing bees every few days, well, I think it's every 2 to 4 days, on these given small plots basically. So a very coarse way to look at it, but really the only way you can easily do it. And then the final thing is that once we know looking at what the flowering and the morphology characteristics are, then what is the actual quality of the sucrose that is being produced. Thank you. So they've got some preliminary results. So this is purple clover and Burr Medic. So again, within our inflorescence there, we have a full range of florets, obviously. And then within that, just to give you some indication, so in the case of purple clover, they got a maximum inflorescent count of up to 104 per plant. Average floret count was 165 per inflorescence. So you got about a bit over 17,000 florets there per plant, essentially. In contrast, if we look at a Burr Medic, which has, although it has a larger number of florences, it has a much smaller floret count. So we end up with about 900. So again, very big differences just there alone in 2 of these species. So the other part of the project is to look at how we might extract that nectar. There's multiple ways that you can do it. The 2 major methods that are being used are what we call microcapillary tubes, and so basically very small tube and you're simply just trying to suck it up. So that can give you an estimate of the volume of the material. And you can then obviously use that material to do further analysis. The other way, which is perhaps somewhat simpler, although a little messier, is just a centrifuge method, basically. Put your flower material into a centrifuge tube and spin it down. So the reason that the nectar is obviously important is that because it's about 30 to 50, nectar is about 30 to 50% sugar, and of that, the primary source of it is sucrose for bees, and to a lesser degree, a small proportion is glucose and fructose. So again, just trying to get a handle on those and the manner in which that might be undertaken. So there's obviously some issues with that. If you're just trying to do it by microcapillary tubes, you clearly require a steady hand, good concentration, and a very good microscope. However, that is a relatively high way to collect material that's of relatively high quality because it's relatively uncontaminated with any other vegetable material. When you're trying to do a centrifugal action, basically, sometimes it can be hard actually getting the flour actually into the centrifuge tube, depending on your system, which may involve quite a lot of cutting. And then obviously once you spin it down, there's obviously quite a potential lot of contamination there with other plant material, other organelle material, etc. So then they will have to then be filtered and that contamination removed then to look at some of that material. So currently DPI are looking at ways to try and to improve the quality of this extraction process. But again, the other way we can look at it is looking at the nectars, we can use either a refractometer or we can use potentially HPLC methods, etc. So these are currently being trialled as to come up with the best potential method. So in summary, it's the start of a long journey. There's a lot to be worked out, so it's only its first year of process. And so we are ultimately hoping to try and get a better linkage between the honeybee industry and our grazing pastoral industries. So the first was just the first year basically establishing trials and doing some of this initial trial work. And then the second year is the final year is next year. And that is basically trying to complete all of the analyses and basically ensure that we have good methods which we can then use for future studies. So in this year, the plan is to basically get a better handle on our bee preferences on our small plots, and again, trying to extract that nectar and get good methods to extract that nectar from those flowers. And so yes, as always, it's a group project, and so Madeline and Mel are the main people doing, and Matt and Richard are their two supervisors. So thank you very much, and any questions? Yes.
What's the next phase after this? Do you intend
So,
narrowing down to a small number and looking at actual
yeah, so I think that,
isolation so they can...
yeah, so the initial objective really was to try and come up with some standard methods, which is what they're doing now, and then from there we will then hand off a list of what we appear based on that original screening to AgriFutures. These are basically the pasture legumes that we think show most promise, and then we're presuming that AgriFutures will take that and hopefully will then fund a larger study, larger plot trials basically. But yes, we'd hope to come up with perhaps a smaller subset of pasture legumes which show that the most promise. Yes?
I was just trying to clarify, are these spaced plugs on that black plastic, or are you seeding your plots?
They are seeded, but yes, within those areas, yes, yep. Yes?
Something that I'm experiencing in my work is trying to use legumes as a pollinator promoter versus like grassland, wildflowers, specifically in the use for solar development. Do you have the same demand in your area? Do you have the same demand in your area looking for plants that work in a solar array that are also pollinator friendly?
Not so much, no. So we obviously have quite large solar panels, but essentially they have generally been put in just in sort of native grass and something like that, so it's not a specific part of it. And just more broadly speaking, in Australia we've used pasture legumes for more than 100 years, so they're a critical part of like a producer in Australia. They're putting in a new pasture system that legumes will not be part of that system. Yes?
Do you have to irrigate the areas where you're planting legumes, or do you have enough rain?
No. So there's relatively little irrigation done in Australia. So all of these are dry land grazing systems.
So going on the assumption that these legumes will be used in pastures grazed by livestock, my question is unclear, I suppose, is how do you consolidate the grazing management alongside letting the legumes get to the flowering stage?
Yeah, I guess the way that to get around that, because generally, yes, we graze them obviously potentially reduce your flower count. I think if you base more on sort of an opportunistic, the reality is that there's, we have millions of hectares of improved pasture systems with legumes into it. And look, if we're honest, there's been, even in perhaps our more native grasslands, you'll often find there's been creep of a range of legumes into those systems over the years. So I guess it's more sort of a scattergun approach that we have large areas, and so some part of those will have some level of flower to